for joining us today for this webinar on A Gender Lens Unfinished, how gender-blind education systems can fail boys as well as girls. We'll be sharing insights from India, Kenya, and South Africa. My name is Dayong Lee. I'm a partner based in London, and I globally co-lead our education to employment practice. Today, we have a packed agenda, and the base for our conversation is insights from these 3 studies conducted last year with the support of the Gates Foundation to understand gender and equity in education. And these were conducted by Population Council for Kenya, Stellenbosch University for South Africa, and my team at Dalberg for India. We'll be sharing some highlights from these studies and then follow up with a panel discussion that unpacks further the why we see what we see in the data, and perhaps most importantly, what we might do about some of these challenges. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce you to Izzy, who is a program officer at the Gates Foundation, who supported and guided each one of these studies. Izzy focuses on the foundational learning in low and middle income countries, working with a range of partners to improve literacy and numeracy outcomes through evidence-based approaches. Izzy, please do share with us why the Gates Foundation decided to invest in these studies.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Dayang. And good morning and afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining from. I'm really excited to be here today. So, sorry, as Dayang said, at the Gates Foundation, our global education team is really focused on improving foundational learning in India and sub-Saharan Africa. And a consistent theme in this work is that progress in learning is not evenly distributed. So one of our priorities is better understanding how learning outcomes are influenced by factors including gender and equity. So not only whether children are in school, but whether they're learning, progressing, and able to translate this into later opportunities. So particularly one of the questions that we're interested in better understanding is how learning translates into outcomes like dropout, completion, and later health and livelihoods outcomes. And importantly, when we started doing this work and this thinking, one of the things that came through very clearly was that the questions and the issues that are really being encountered are not only different across countries, but even within countries. So, gender can interact with poverty, geography, language, school quality, social norms in ways that vary from one state or district to another. So that was one of the reasons we invested in this set of diagnostics that we will be discussing today, to really understand in India, Kenya, and South Africa, what are the equity challenges for learning, and particularly for gender, look like, and how can we better use the information and the evidence from these studies to better support targeted context-specific solutions. So these diagnostics sit within our broader learning agenda around gender and education, and it's really the intent here is to try and strengthen the evidence base on how learning interacts with gender to shape those later outcomes, and how that evidence can guide us and our partners towards more effective solutions for improving learning and those later outcomes. And one of the things that I'm really excited about, that we're not going to have the chance to go into detail about today, but hopefully in future conversations, is the recent launch of the Gender and Learning Fund in partnership with Brink, which will really focus on supporting and generating evidence around some of these questions, the relationship between learning, gender, and later outcomes. And I think hopefully we should have a couple of colleagues from Brink on the call. So if you have further questions on that, we can direct to them. But just really excited to be able to share the lessons from these 3 diagnostics, and really looking forward to the great panel that we have today. So I'm going to pass back to the Dalberg team, but thanks so much for inviting us to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. So today's conversation, we're going to be unpacking 3 questions. As I mentioned, first and foremost, what does the data really show us about who is being left behind? And secondly, why? What does taking a gender lens really reveal about the drivers of these learning gaps for both girls and for boys? It's important to note that while we wanted to actually include outcomes and how the picture differs for non-binary students, As you might imagine, the data was just too sparse for a deep enough analysis of that. So those segments of children are missing, unfortunately, but we want to call that out as an important research agenda for going forward. And then finally, what actions can we actually take to build a stronger, more gender transformative education system that works for all children, girls as well as for boys? Before we dive into the content, I think it's important to frame the discussion on what it's about, just as importantly as what this conversation is not about. So we are hoping to take a gender lens on education system, building on the years of efforts as a community to address some of these structural barriers to girls' education, many of which remain, and we'll dive into further. And we recognize that some boys are increasingly disengaging in ways that matter for gender equality. And we're hoping to take a relational and systems approach that sees girls' and boys' outcomes as deeply interconnected. And we believe that advancing gender equality benefits girls, boys, and society at large. What today's discussion is not about is a zero-sum shift away from girls' education. We have no intention of rolling back the hard-won gains for girls and to sort of minimize the important challenges that still remain. And we're avoiding intentionally a boys versus girls narrative, or claiming that boys are universally disadvantaged, which is not true. And this is not a biologically deterministic narrative or a call for boy-specific pedagogies, but rather interventions that truly take a gender lens that unpack what kind of impacts it can have for girls that might be different for boys. And we recognize that this is not going to be a quick fix, but there needs to be a sustained and more gender transformative reform. So as we begin this discussion, we wanted to recognize that the focus on girls' education in the Global South over the past several decades have helped deliver some of the greatest success in bridging the gap in enrollment overall. But the averages tend to hide the sort of story underneath, which is far more nuanced. So if you look at the left-hand side chart, this black line that is tracking the global gender parity index in primary and secondary school enrollment, it looks like, in the last maybe 15 years or so, it's pretty much reached parity. However, if you double click on that global line, various colors emerge. In low-income countries, this is on the very bottom, light pink, girls in upper secondary school age are still more likely to be out of school by a sizable gap, 59% of girls versus 51% of boys. In upper middle income countries, however, which is the maroon color, second to top, this trend is reversed. For example, 15% of girls versus 22% of boys are out of school. If we disaggregate the data further within countries, we also see a lot of nuance. For example, in India, the gender gap really varies by community. For example, the parity index of learners by enrollment, it's actually under 1 for the marginalized communities. For example, the poorest wealth segments, 0.84, even worse for scheduled tribes, and worse for girls from migrant worker households, only 0.59, for example, while this flips and boys in urban areas or top 2 wealth segments actually underperform their girl peers. And so we recognize that there remain important institutional barriers to education, for example, curriculum and teaching practices that may be biased and give more voice to boys, for example, or actually have role models in leadership that may be more reflecting of boys, weak safeguards around harassment policies, for example, and practices, perhaps limited female leadership at the institution level, There remain still harmful gender societal expectations and practices, for example, the unpaid care burden and domestic chores that fall disproportionately on girls, early child marriage, norms around safety and mobility that may be a hindrance to girls' education, gender-based violence that persists within schools and outside. And perhaps the data is most stark and actually most universal across persistent labor market inequalities and the school to work transition and beyond, where there are significant gaps in what jobs girls choose versus boys, and significant underrepresentation of women and girls in the paid workforce versus significant overrepresentation in unpaid care work, as we discussed, as well as underrepresentation in more senior leadership positions. And even when women and men have the same job roles, a meaningful gap in pay. However, we also want to recognize that there is a rising concern around boys' disengagement in schools and in education systems. In the global north context, I think there has been a much more sort of mainstream conversation around boys' disengagement, also as it relates to political religious extremism, for example, or gender-based violence, and kind of tying to the toxic masculinity conversations and so forth. But we also recognize that while more nascent, there is also an emerging body of research, including what we are sharing today, and concerns around how this manifests in the global south context. And so we're looking forward to unpacking that further in the 3 country case studies, as well as the analysis of what might be driving some of these gaps. And to do so, I am excited to introduce you all to my colleague Tanya, who is an associate partner based in Johannesburg, who leads a lot of our gender work, especially in the African context. She was one of the leading architects of Dalberg's Gender Lens commitment to apply a gender lens across all of our projects, whether it's in education deployment like this one, or health and financial inclusion and so forth. So welcome, Tanya, and please take us ahead into the country case studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dion. So that global concern around boys' educational disengagement is validated across the 3 countries, which revealed some real disengagement challenges for boys. However, it's important to note that girls are not faring better overall, especially when we look at labour market outcomes. As you'll see, it's a very nuanced story. So what we're going to do now is ground ourselves in a synthesis of what emerged across the research. So let's start with South Africa, looking at the excellent research from Dr. Gabrielle Wills from the University of Stellenbosch. Now here, like the other 2 countries, absolute scores are low for all learners, both boys and girls. But unlike the other countries, boys are increasingly falling further behind over time across most metrics. Let's look in more detail. So enrolment, you can see that we're at near gender parity. Boys are slightly more likely to be enrolled, but completion, school completion, is where we start to see the large disparities emerge. Boys are more likely to drop out and repeat at every grade level, with a gender gap of up to 12 percentage points. When we move to learning and learning outcomes, the picture is stark. So again, absolute reading and math scores are low for all children. But boys are increasingly scoring lower than girls, and we see, for example, a gender gap in reading widening from around 25 percentage points to 57 percentage points in a 10-year period. Despite that, though, when we move to thriving and earning, looking at the labour market itself does not reflect this, and we see labour force participation about 12 percentage points higher for men, and women earn on average about 20% less than men. If we move to Kenya, the story becomes very intersectional, with the interplay of gender, with region, culture, and poverty shaping very different risks for boys and girls. So starting at enrolment, we see that there has been near universal enrolment achieved in primary and lower secondary, but averages really hide what's happening in the northeastern province in particular, where, for example, girls are less likely to be enrolled in school by nearly 9 percentage points. School completion is also a mixed story, where boys are more likely to drop out of primary school in 6 to 8 regions, but secondary school completion is low for both girls and boys in the northeastern region particularly, and this is due to child marriage for girls and pressure to work for boys respectively being the drivers there. Moving from completion to learning outcomes then, with the exception of the northeast region where many fewer girls and boys can read, boys actually have slightly lower literacy outcomes across most regions, and here we see that poverty is a key predictor of learning outcomes. And then finally, moving to thriving and earning, we see a similar picture emerging to South Africa where labour force participation remains unequal and women are earning around 30% less. The NEET rate, which is those who are not in employment, educational training, is double that for women. So a very nuanced picture emerging there. And then finally, moving to India. So similar to Kenya, averages just don't tell the full story. And again, we see the interplay of gender with geography, wealth, and other identities influencing outcomes across our buckets. So again, starting with enrollment, we see that the poorest and migrant girls remain excluded from the system. But interestingly, in wealthier and urban segments, boys are more likely than girls to have never enrolled or to drop out of school. A similar intersectional story emerges for learning outcomes, where geography is a strong predictor of how well children do. And we see boys lagging in the southern and eastern states and girls falling behind in the northern states. And then finally, moving to thriving and earning, the story here becomes a pattern, where we see that the female labour force participation is half that of men, and the NEET rate, so that was not in an employment, educational training, is 4 times that of men for women. So given this data, it just isn't accurate to paint a simple picture that boys are falling behind. The story is very nuanced. And what we're seeing here is that this is not a relative failure, where girls or boys perform better in some cases. It's an absolute failure of a gender-blind system that has not enabled boys nor girls to thrive. And many of you were asking what is driving this pattern. And some of the answer can really be found in the gender lens. So the gender lens is something we applied over the past few decades when we were trying to better understand girls' educational exclusion. And we found that at the root cause here were gender norms, roles and expectations and other structural barriers really shaping educational pathways. Now on this slide you can see a beautiful framework from Equimundo that was adapted here to really help us understand some of the drivers at different levels. So when we apply this to girls, you can see 4 levels. So the internal, which is around girls' self-perception, how gender norms shape how girls see themselves as learners. For example, viewing schooling as secondary to marriage or caregiving. If we go up 1 level, we see there are drivers at the household and peer level, looking at how families, peers and communities shape those expectations around gender roles, respectability and accepted behaviour. So this might be around care responsibilities or mobility restrictions or early marriage pressures, where brothers' schooling might be prioritised where resources are scarce. We then move up 1 level to the school system level. So this is where schools and formal institutions may unintentionally be reinforcing gendered expectations through policies, pedagogy and infrastructure. Examples here being around the tolerance of gender-based violence, for instance, or gender stereotyping in curricula, or limited female teachers in leadership. And then finally, we move to the top level, the systemic level, which is the wider social, cultural and economic and labour market systems shaping expectations around girls' roles and their future responsibility. So there's been a lot of work around the drivers for girls' educational exclusion using a gender lens. We can apply the same gender lens to boys' educational disengagement, which reveals similar root causes with different manifestations. So again, we look at the same 4 spheres of influence, the same 4 driver levels. And if we start at the bottom, so instead of girls' self-perception, we're looking at boys' self-perception here. So we talked about this manifesting for girls as maybe viewing schooling as secondary to marriage or caregiving. For boys, this might manifest as identity conflicts between schooling and earning. It might look like disengagement from non-masculine subjects such as reading. It might manifest as, for instance, emotional suppression affecting learning and classroom participation. So you see that the same sphere of influence, the same drivers around gender norms, but the manifestation looks quite different for boys and girls. And maybe I'll just give one more example here at the school system level. So we saw for girls this could manifest as a tolerance of gender-based violence and gender stereotyping curricula, and maybe limited female teachers at leadership level. If we apply this lens for boys, this might look like higher rates of disciplinary action and suspension. It might look for like less support for socio-emotional development. It might look like limited male teachers at the ECD, the early childhood development level, in primary school, and so on and so forth. So really what we're showing here is that applying a gender lens to boys can reveal what is going on in the same way that it did for girls. So then the question becomes, what can we do about it? So we know there's some simple principles here that are important. So firstly, this cannot be seen as a zero-sum game. It's not about looking at boys versus girls. As we saw from the 3-country analysis, the intersectional lens is extremely important. And as we saw from the driver analysis in that last couple of slides, the systems and gender lens is very important. So very briefly then, sharing at a very high level that there are promising shared intervention points for boys and girls, although there are some very specific gender responsive interventions that are needed beyond this as well. So the first is improving education for all. So we know that one of the key levers is to improve the quality of the education system broadly, and that in itself making a difference. We know that on the second point here, that addressing gender norms and expectations directly as part of gender transformative education is important, whether that's around girls' gender roles and expectations or around masculinities. The third is around engaging the ecosystem around boys and girls, so that's around families, teachers, community, institutions. The fourth is around foundational learning, and this is specifically around helping boys falling too far behind. And then finally, at a very high level, it's around gender transformative policies and the financing of their implementation. So this is very high level, but it's just recognizing here that to really make some of these come to life, it's about providing a contextual lens. There are some gaps in understanding the drivers at a very contextual level, at the country level, and similarly, gaps around trying to make some of these more high-level interventions really relevant at the country level as well.
So with that then, as a little bit of framing, if we move to the next slide, we'd love just to introduce our panel, who we will be hearing from now. So first we have Dr. Gabrielle Wills, who is an education economist at Stellenbosch University, and she specializes in education economics and education policy, with a specific focus on learning outcomes, inequality, and system performance in South Africa. We'll then be joined in conversation by Dr. Ruth Nanjeho from the Population Council, and she is currently leading the Evidence for Gender and Education Resource Project, which maps gender and education evidence, policies and programs to really identify what works for where and whom. And she has been very involved in reviewing the 2015 education and training sector gender policy in Kenya as well. We will then be in conversation with Merlia Chakar, who's the founder and CEO of the Maddie Foundation. This is an India-based organization working to strengthen foundational learning outcomes through system reform, and she really focuses on early grade pedagogy, teacher capacity, and an equity-driven approach to improving learning for all. We will then open the aperture. So we will have had a wonderful conversation, a deep conversation at the country level. We're then going to step back and speak to Sally Gear, who is the practice lead for gender equality and inclusion at the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, who supports education system transformation in LMICs. Sally brings extensive experience in global education policy, financing, and gender responsive reform. And she designed and led a 335 million Girls Education Challenge program, which was the largest global fund focused specifically on the most marginalized girls in low income and fragile affected countries. And then last but not least, we'll be speaking with Cody Ragonesi, who oversees Equimundo's global portfolio of programs. So Equimundo is the Center for Masculinities and Social Justice. And in his role, Cody oversees the design and implementation of programs and curricula for boys, young men, and fathers, collaborating with national governments, multilateral institutions, and the private sector and civil society to most broadly advance gender transformative approaches. So really pleased to have all of these luminaries in the room with us today. And would now love to start the conversation with Dr. Gabrielle Wills from Stellenbosch University. So Gabrielle, like the other two country studies, we see in South Africa that absolute learning outcomes are low. But unlike the other two countries, there are much larger gender gaps, with boys falling behind and that increasing over time. Can you share a little bit more about what you found in your research?
Thank you very much for having me, Tanya, and for bringing all these people together. In South Africa, we have a somewhat unusual situation by global standards. So although our educational access rates are relatively similar across boys and girls up to the age of about 15, we have a very large pro-girl learning gap in the country, and at least since about 2011, girls have outperformed boys on average, and this is irrespective of grade or the subject that they are studying, and girls have been outperforming boys on virtually all international and national assessments, and that's at least since about 2011, and it potentially started much earlier than that. In particular, we have a very large pro-girl reading advantage, and this has been growing over time. So if we look at, for example, at the grade 4 or 5 Pearls reading results, in the latest round, South Africa has the largest pro-girl reading gap of all countries. That's over 50 countries that participate. And we find this pro-girl reading gap not just at a primary level, but also at a secondary level, and it's roughly about at least a gap that's equivalent to about a year of learning. So if we take a child in grade 4, a girl in grade 4, on average, she will be a year ahead of a boy on average in reading. And this is large, and this gap has been increasing quite substantially in the past 10 to 15 years. We also have a large pro-girl advantage in mathematics, and this has been growing over time, and this is somewhat unusual. So if we, for example, take the Trends in International Mathematics study of 2023, South Africa is the only participating country that has a significant pro-girl gap at the grade 5 level. And that gap remains until about grade 9 at least. And it's roughly about 0.7 years, or 70% of the year of learning. It could be a little bit less than that, but it could be as large as 70% of the learning as well, which is unusual. So that's a core finding. We also know that our gaps, learning gaps, increase and they are augmented within the schooling system. So if we look at gaps in reading or mathematics in grade 1, and where already girls are quite significantly ahead, by the time they get to grade 4, those gaps have almost doubled in size. So there's clearly something going on in the schooling system where these gaps are being augmented. But we also know that there's a pro-girl gap even as children enter into the schooling system and before they even start. So we see this in emergent literacy, in emergent numeracy, and on fine motor coordination, for example. And the cumulative impact of boys being behind girls, but specifically being behind with respect to where they should be in terms of meeting grade level expectations, is that grade repetition rates are substantially higher amongst boys than girls, and at every single grade, but particularly when they approach towards the end of schooling, dropout rates are much higher amongst boys relative to girls as well. If we think about, well, what could be kind of the drivers of this, it's not entirely yet clear what those are. We know that a large part of the problem stems from quite simply not remediating the gaps. There is a little bit of evidence that some of the gap quantitatively can be explained by some cognitive or social emotional differences between boys and girls, but the largest part of the gap is most likely related to these learning gaps which have not been remediated earlier on. although there are some of these social emotional dimensions that play in. But there's a very strong interconnection with poverty or socioeconomic status. So we do not find very large pro-girl gender gaps in the wealthier part of the schooling system, but they are much larger in the poorer part of the schooling system. That is where we observe them, and that is where we observe this augmentation of the gap across the primary school years in the South African context. And there is some augmentation of this gap in the wealthier part of the system, but it's not nearly as pronounced. And it's particularly prevalent in the poorer part of the system, and particularly in home language acquisition skills. And then just to say, I think another very important point on this is that in the South African context, I think we have to be really careful to not get fixated on the gender gap in learning. And the reason why I say this is because the size of this pro-girl gap, even though it's large by international standards, when we consider how that gap relative to the socioeconomic learning divide in South Africa, it is considerably smaller. So roughly, if we take, for example, the size of the grade 5 pro-girl gap in quintile 1 schools, it was just 13% of the size of the learning divide between learners in the poorest and the richer school deciles. And so as a nation, we really have to think quite carefully about the ethics of saying, well, let's try and address the gender gap, but really what we need to be focusing on is raising learning outcomes for all children, boys and girls across the entire schooling system.
Yeah, it's fascinating what you're sharing, Gabrielle. And to that point around raising outcomes for all, would love to hear what actions you would prioritize to help the education system respond a bit more effectively to these patterns.
So I think we as a nation, I think we've been, at least the education system as a whole, has been really struggling with what it means in South Africa to remediate gaps. There is some experimentation going on with respect to how one can improve pedagogy within schools, particularly in strengthening teacher pedagogy, particularly in language and in the teaching of African languages. I mean, we have some evidence about what could work in that regard, but this is an ongoing issue, and the costs around it, the training costs around it, you know, these are the things that are being experimented with, and there are certainly intentions to scale more promising kind of structured pedagogy approaches within the poorer part of the schooling system. So this is really fundamental. We have to remediate the gaps early on. And that is going to be, this is not a gender-specific intervention by any means, but by the nature of the fact that boys are behind girls, and there are more boys behind, there are more boys that are suffering or struggling academically than girls, that the offer of remediation or differentiated instruction, for example, such as teaching at the right level, would naturally take on a gender dimension within the South African context, simply because of who is behind more than others. And then just in general, I think the evidence internationally is quite clear that a non-gender target approach to improving learning tends to be more effective than gender targeted approaches. And this is due to the nature of where often the main binding constraint to learning lies, and that's in low quality pedagogy in schools, which affects both boys and girls. There's a very interesting review by David Evans in One, which you can find online. It's a 2022 review, which kind of evaluates gender specific versus gender non-targeted interventions, and really just finds that for the most part, the non-gender targeted approaches were more effective for addressing issues of learning. Of course, there are other aspects around children's development which are not just about learning, and I think that requires potentially another approach, and that might be more suited to gender targeted approaches. So I think fundamentally we cannot get away from the fact that the most evidence we have around why boys disengage in learning is related to the issues of academic struggle. That said, I do not want to discount the fact that there might be more gender-specific lenses to approaching this problem, specifically in secondary schools or in adolescence. So there might be a need to address the gendered nature of school dropout, where there are other factors that are contributing to that, and being higher amongst boys than girls. So bullying, for example, violence, gang-related influences, substance abuse, which tend to affect boys more than girls. And in this area, there might be a gender-specific kind of program that is required. And then in general, I think the lack of psychosocial support to support both girls and boys, but I think particularly where young boys or adolescents are struggling with issues of identity, and particularly, I think there's an issue around the lack of fathers in South Africa. So we have very low rates of children living with two parents and particularly a father in the country. It's extremely low. And I think that this cannot be ignored. And so the need for mentoring male mentors in schools is probably very important, and particularly in a context where the majority of our educators are female. So about 70% of South African educators are female. There's probably a lack, I mean, just on the basis of that statistic, there's a lack of male leadership in the schooling system. And that sits on top of an issue of having a lack of fathers in households as well. So those are just a few things one could do.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And also taking away that there is a research gap here to really dig into the drivers in South Africa. And I'm sure there's a lot that could be learned from other contexts there as well. So thank you so much for those interventions. All right, moving to Ruth then in Kenya. Ruth, welcome. Would love to shift gears and hear about a bit more what's happening in Kenya around enrollment, completion and learning for boys and girls.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Generally in Kenya, when we look at it from the national level, we can say that access to education is near universal, especially primary, when it comes to primary school. But when moving now to secondary school, that is where disparities start emerging. And currently, there's not much, when it comes to secondary access, there's not much disparity, but however, boys are lagging behind girls. And that is looking at a national level. But again, when you look at the county levels, maybe just a bit of context, Kenya has got 47 counties. And in each of these specific counties, it has got different trends. So we have some counties where we find girls doing better in terms of access as compared to boys and vice versa, especially in the ASAL counties, Mandera, maybe for those who are aware of the Kenyan context. So generally the northeastern counties, when you look at access overall for both boys and girls, we have 4 counties where enrollment is still below 40%. And this is affecting both boys and girls. So I would say that looking at both genders, I would say that as much as the national averages would portray that we have near gender parity, but we have disparities when you go to county levels and even going further to sub-county levels. So in terms of access, yeah, universal, I mean, at national level, it's near parity, but disparities emerge at county and sub-county levels. And when it also comes to completion, also the same trend emerges whereby primary completion rates, in some counties, you'll find boys completing at a higher rate as compared to girls. But generally, there is an even rates of progression across genders despite broader national improvements. So I would say when it comes to access and completion, both boys and girls are affected. They are remaining behind depending on the context. And when it comes to learning outcomes, and this is particularly looking at maybe literacy and numeracy, we find that both girls and boys are affected, and this is more so in ASAL counties. As much as girls may be doing fairly well when it comes to literacy, but also they are lacking behind when it comes to numeracy. So boys do well in numeracy, but girls do well in reading, like in English and Swahili. So for Kenya, I would say that it's no longer a story of progress in access, but issues of completion and learning, like are they completing, are they learning? Because the country has really tried, whereby access is near like gender parity, but now the issue is keeping this, I mean, as much as they're accessing, they're attending school, are they learning, are they progressing to the next level of education or not? So it's more of persistent structural inequalities in completion and learning. Yeah, otherwise access, I think we are better off, like we are doing better at a national level. Yeah.
Which is just it's very much a nuanced story, an intersectional story in Kenya. As you say, you can't just look at the national average, you really need to look under the surface. And given that, then I'm curious to hear from you, Ruth. Can you share more about some of the key barriers affecting boys and girls, and what's driving the patterns you just described?
Okay, thank you for that question. So we have what is driving the barriers, or maybe let me mention the barriers first. So we have barriers which are specific to boys, and we have barriers which are specific to girls. But again, we also have barriers that are just cutting across. And maybe I will start with barriers that are affecting both boys and girls, because they affect them differently. And one of the key barriers is the economic vulnerability, whereby due to pressures on boys, economic pressures, you find that boys are dropping out of school and engage in income generating activities. Like those who come from the lake, the counties near the lake region, they will drop out and go fishing. Those who come maybe from coastal region, they will drop out and become beach boys. And so that economic vulnerability affecting both boys and girls. Like for girls, they will drop out and maybe engage into get married early, or they can even engage into transactional relationships. So poverty is a major driver for both boys and girls. And also talk of the school climate and safety. Whereby, like for example, in these marginalized counties, like the northeastern counties, where the children have to trek for long distances to school. So the safety issues, and in this case, girls are more affected as compared to boys, but both genders are affected. And also looking at the school now, maybe the school climate, like the reporting mechanisms when it comes to like school-related gender-based violence, maybe the weak reporting systems, and then like even the gender-insensitive discipline practices, the support that these children are expected to get maybe from the teachers who are also not trained maybe in gender-responsive pedagogy. So you realize that school environment and generally safety when they are on their way to school and home has also been of a big impact to school dropout or being retained in school. So girls are often pushed out by safety and pregnancy-related issues, and boys are often pushed out by disengagement and also disciplinary cases, because when now they become disengaged into drugs, and later on they just like drop out of school. And then another barrier is gender norms, for girls, we have gender norms around caregiving roles, around early marriage expectations. And for boys, especially in counties where culture is still strong, like they still have some retrospective cultural norms, where a boy, once he gets circumcised, is considered as a grown-up and is expected to defend the society or the community. So that norms around masculinity, they discourage like academic persistence. And again, like even the expectations around boys, you know, boys are seen as protectors, they are seen as providers. So most of them would drop out of school and just like want to engage into these income and generating activities to support even their families, especially in cases where poverty is high. And also, I'll talk of maybe weak implementation systems. In Kenya, we have policies. We have so many policies. So I would say policies exist. And like we have a reentry policy whereby it's expected like girls who've dropped out of school due to pregnancy, they're expected to go back to school. So there's policy, but the problem is uneven implementation. Yeah, so because of that, you know, as much as we have policy, but because they are not implemented or there is an even implementation, then that one will also have an impact to some of these schooling outcomes or barriers to schooling. So the patterns are more or less systematic, rather to looking at maybe at individual failures. And again, all these barriers also intersect. Yeah.
Ruth, I'm just going to pause you there. Sorry to interrupt you. So it sounds like it's at every level, like almost like that framework, you know, from the institutional and the systemic all the way down to the interpersonal in terms of family expectations and the internal as well. So thank you so much for providing that very comprehensive response. I wish we had more time, but we've got to move on now to so thank you again, Ruth, for your interventions.
Thank you.
So moving on then to Merlia, welcome. Would like to draw a bit of a parallel here with Kenya, given India, like Kenya, resists generalizations that boys are falling behind in terms of an overall narrative because of how gender interplays with geography, wealth, and other identities. It's a very nuanced and intersectional story. So we've seen that geography plays an important role, with girls being more at risk of falling behind in the northern states, and this being the reverse with boys falling behind in the southern or eastern states. And I'd love for you to share a bit more about what do we know about these geographies that is driving different results.
Hi, Tanya. Thank you so much. Truly a pleasure to be here. One of the few panels that I've attended in recent days on gender. It's usually just very restricted to foundational learning. So thank you for the platform to share my thoughts. I come from Tamil Nadu, and it's one of the more developed states in India, relatively speaking. We have one of the highest HDIs in the country. Paradoxically, we somehow also have the lowest ranking when it in the bottom 5 or 10 when it comes to foundational learning outcomes. So I'm still we're still scratching our head on that. But I think Tamil Nadu has been very deliberate about its gender policy for almost 5 to 6 decades now. Tamil Nadu's politics is deeply influenced by reformers like Periyar and Anna, who made gender empowerment and female participation in education and the workforce a primary agenda in their manifestos, and that has continued through the decades in a bipartisan way, in a way that it hasn't really, the focus really hasn't shifted regardless of who the incumbent government has been. And that has resulted in a lot of policies and decisions that have favored girls and women, both in education and livelihoods. We have one of the lowest dropout rates for girls in secondary education in the country, say, for example, compared to Uttar Pradesh. So Uttar Pradesh has 1/3 the number of secondary schools, despite having 3 times the student population of Tamil Nadu. So what typically happens there is when girls reach a certain age, especially around puberty, if there isn't a secondary school or a middle school in the neighborhood, you can sort of rest assured that the parents are going to, pull the child out of school, fearing for their safety, right? And in these cases, despite the kind of returns that education can provide, safety becomes an existential issue. And therefore, Tamil Nadu, to a great extent, has solved for it by ensuring access to a neighborhood middle or secondary school for girls, especially. And therefore, this is a classic case. India is a classic case of how patriarchy affects both girls and boys. I think we sort of limit our our sort of association of patriarchy with what it does to women and how it sort of affects every sphere of our life. But I think in many cases, patriarchy affects boys and their well-being as well. And while Tamil Nadu is a progressive reformist state, it has had, some of their policies have had some unintended consequences on the life outcomes for boys. And among them is possibly, boys dropping out. They're twice as likely to drop out secondary school than girls, because there is a certain aspiration to get into the labor market, be seen as the breadwinner in the family. It could be that in the same household you have both the girl and the boy employed and bringing home equal, almost more or less equal kind of incomes, but the notion of masculinity and needing to be seen as the head of the household continues to affect boys' perception, of perception of role models that they have, right? And similarly, over the years, over the last 10 years, Tamil Nadu's had sort of increasing unemployment rates among graduates, especially, right? And more so among male graduates. So there is this growing skepticism about the return on education as an investment, and therefore boys generally tend to believe they'd rather drop out, join the workforce earlier and start earning, rather than spend that many more years, which is sort of an opportunity loss for them.
Thank you so much, Melia. Again, a lot of nuance and richness in what you're sharing in terms of how it differs. Maybe just one more question, if I may then, given where we are on time. You talked a lot about how the patriarchy affects men and boys as well. And, the global gender agenda of the last few decades, as we know, has centered women and girls' empowerment, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how do we avoid undermining that focus while also normalizing work with boys and men, not just as allies, but as a focus in their own right?
I think, it is a case of, like you said, nuance and context. There isn't, India is large, it's a continent masquerading as a country. And therefore, I think the realities in each state, the context in each state, all kinds of realities, the social realities, the economic realities, the political realities need to be taken into consideration before, we sort of jump in on a national agenda. Honestly, I think a national agenda is useful to a large extent, but we must acknowledge that some of these problems can only be solved for at the grassroots level, or at least at the level of a state. And I think it's absolutely necessary to not pit this as a girls versus boys narrative. This is about system failing children in context, right? And therefore, we need to target girls where, say, early marriage or safety are driving out dropouts, and we need to target boys where, you know, there are these labor market aspirations or workplace aspirations that are pulling them out of school, and really look at what the local data is telling us, and sort of formulate policy around it. I think I echo the sentiments of everyone who spoke before me in terms of being necessary to create curriculum and sort of gender responsive pedagogy for young children, role models in schools, and just bringing back the focus that some pockets need to be looked at with a different lens than others, and really go into those micro details.
And I think I'll stop us there, Merlia, at that point, which I think wraps us up really nicely. Thank you so much for your insights. We all learned a lot. And we will now step back to open the aperture a bit and look a bit more globally. And I'd love to invite Sally from GP and to come in here and explain and maybe talk us through your access within and through systems framework, which is a really powerful way of helping us think about gender inequality in education writ large for both girls and boys. And I'll try and put that in the chat for people to look at.
Lovely, thanks Tanya, and hello everybody. It's a real pleasure to be in this conversation and those fascinating studies. There's obviously a lot in the chat asking to see them, and so I know there'll be a lot of appetite to sort of dig deeper, and I've certainly learnt a lot just by listening to you all. So I know we're a bit short of time, but I just very quickly, and I'm sure most of you have heard of the Global Partnership for Education, but just by way of context it might be helpful. So we're a global fund. We're the world's largest global fund supporting education in lower and lower middle income countries. Very briefly, but loads of information on the website. We work in over 90 countries, but the principle of how we work is very much a partnership principle. So our funds come behind an inclusive policy dialogue with obviously ministries of education, but bringing together development partners, civil society and private foundations. Just to say, and I just want to jump on this bandwagon, that very much our approach is grounded in data and evidence, and that really informs and has informed our work on gender equality. So just to say, our last strategy, GP 2025, put a real priority on gender hardwiring in every single part of our processes, and my job was to try and work out what that actually meant in practice, and working with our partners on that. And then our future strategy, which has just been published a couple of weeks ago, GP 2030, is really building on this approach, strengthening the approach to intersectionality, which we've talked about a lot here, and how gender intersects with poverty, disability and refugee inclusion, and obviously those subnational levels, and particularly areas which are affected by conflict or climate affected disasters. So back to the question, Tanya, for our approach, and just a reminder, so I'm based in the Secretariat, so we don't sort of design projects. We work very much on a system level with ministries of education and with local partners, and we thought it would be helpful to have this sort of framing, to frame policy dialogue. So it's in the chat. We call it access within and through. Very obvious, I think, to many here, but just sort of conceptualizing in this way has helped us. And we had an independent review of what we were doing just to sort of shift the dial a little bit, so we didn't get just stuck on certain learning or access, but seeing this in a much more sort of holistic way. So access is around who gets into the system. We know that their numbers of out-of-school children are unfortunately increasing across the globe, and we know they're gendered. But within that, more broadly, we know that children, that highly marginalised girls, those girls that are affecting the intersectional barriers, are probably still the most likely never to have enrolled in school. But now we're looking at dropout patterns and seeing that obviously, for all the reasons we're learning here, there's certain groups of boys that are becoming disengaged with education at certain points and leaving education. So our policy on out-of-school children really has to be informed into that nuance, and we have those sort of conversations with our country partners. But obviously, we can't stop at access because, you know, as we all know, we had a big push, big success on enrollment, but then we had, as what we've all termed slightly, I think, unfortunately, the learning crisis. But we do know that what matters within schools is equally important. And again, that's gendered. So there's gender inequality in the way everyday school processes occur. We know that there's far more male head teachers than there are female head teachers. We know that curricular representation matters for both boys and girls. We also know that harmful social norms really affect engagement, as we've heard about. But then also interestingly and importantly, we are also seeing at the same time an increase in gender-based violence within schools. And if we have time just to go on in some of our partner countries where we see a real problem in boys dropout, at the same time we're seeing a massive increase in girls being impacted with on sexually based violence. And it would be great to get more research on that correlation between those two. I mean, anecdotally you think there would be, and I'm sure Cody's going to talk a bit about that, but this comes back to the general message of this seminar, that really it's all about girls and boys, and making an inclusive gender equal system is going to really benefit all. So I think the through piece is the ambition, and we've heard about this. I really loved your framing earlier, Tanya, on that last bucket on the labour market issue and that pathways. And again, what we're seeing is that really thinking about that dialogue with countries, that we don't just stop at getting the qualification. We know that in certain countries, for example, we've got very educated females who reach tertiary education, but once we go into the workforce, we see this pattern overall that there's huge differentiation both in participation and pay gap. And this can't be dealt with separately from education, I think, is what the message is. So I'll just stop there, Tanya, on the framing.
And I love your gender analysis. I think you framed it up so in such a nuanced way. I'm going to just ask one more question, Sally, and if I could ask you just to try and respond in 1 minute so that we have time for Cody. And I'm sorry about the time.
That's fine. No, we need to listen to Cody, definitely. So.
It's just recognizing that, you know, you've got many decades of experience applying a gender lens to girls' education, and we didn't always do it well. And we're currently facing a backlash. So what I'd just love to hear from you, is there, you know, one or two mistakes that we made that we should avoid repeating when looking at addressing boys' educational disengagement?
Yeah, very much so. So first of all, I think, and we've said it, you know, treating girls as a homogenous group. So, thinking that all girls everywhere were much more disadvantaged than boys, and in a way pitting boys against girls at the get-go. But then moving into some of so in my previous life, I worked for a donor for 15, 16 years. I won't name that one, but you can probably guess from my accent. Obviously we know that the benefits, and it was really important when we saw the data on girls, but by just targeting girls alone, and I have seen projects whereby there's literally boys and girls in the same community, and girls are receiving a load of resources and the boys are not actually getting those. These are donor funded programs. And of course, what that does create is a massive backlash. And then those girls are probably more likely to be affected by violence, and also that just creates. So we certainly don't want to go down that route. And I think others have said it, that, I mean, I do believe actually, I mean, slightly in slight disagreement with the earlier comment, that I think you probably do need some targeted interventions, that raising the whole system, yes, that will eventually, but sometimes you do need targeted for highly marginalized girls, and also maybe programs that create safe boys spaces so they're able to talk to each other and work with each other. As long as we include the recognition that overall we need a system that works for boys and girls. So, I mean, I've got a few examples. I know we haven't got time. You know me, Tanya, you shouldn't have invited me because I could just talk for hours, but thank you very much.
No, this is wonderful. This is why you wanted
to
invite this panel. Sally, thank you so much for the insight. So Cody, last but by no means least, would love to hear from you about the drivers of boys' disengagement, underachievement, and what to do about it.
Yeah, thanks. I am trying to gather my thoughts in a little time, because this conversation has been so rich, and sort of in the chat as well. A lot of questions are really prompting responses there around measurement and around sort of framing. I just want to say sort of my framing note around this, definitely not a zero-sum game, right? We talked about that, so I won't stress that point more. I also think bringing in sort of a gender equality lens, Sally had mentioned this in her remarks as well, we're seeing masculinity in education fueling gender equality, right? The more gender equitable boys are, the less violence, the more caregiving. As they grow older, the more sort of benefits to society and their their intergenerational relationships as well as their interpersonal relationships. We also see masculinity really fueling disengagement, right? Tanya, you talked in the beginning in that sort of socioecological model around the individual attitudes and beliefs around what it means to be a man does really impact their own belonging, sense of belonging in schools, their own aspirations. And when we think about what it means to be a man in a lot of the contexts that we talked about earlier today, we talk about emotional suppression, we talk about competition, we talk about avoiding help-seeking behaviors. We talk about sort of dominance and humor and disruption. And we talk about that pressure to be a provider, as we saw in the chat and a lot of the speakers before, that sort of shift to early work really senses a disengagement there in education. I think one of the challenges that we're faced with is how to transition that from pathologizing boys into that asset-based approach, right? For decades, we've talked about a girl can be anything a boy can be. What are we telling our boys that they can be, right? So I really think taking bravery, taking strength, and redefining what that means in a school setting can do wonders in terms of bravery can be asking a question in class that they don't know the answer to, right? It doesn't need to be that traditional provider and protector role that we've heard time and time again. But how can we sort of shift the narrative around what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a man in society and have that be pro-education, pro-engagement, pro-social behavior? And in terms of what we can do about it, we're working actually with GPE and KICS on a project in Malawi, Cambodia, and Lesotho in designing a whole school approach on boys' disengagement in education. What that means is, from a curriculum guide for ministries of education to really integrate this masculinities lens into their teacher training, into their K through 12 curricula. And then we're also helping teachers with that capacity strengthening around biases, around pedagogies. There's a great program that started in the US called Boys Who Write that take a project-based learning approach, right? Simple shifts in the way that we're teaching boys and really engaging with them in school can make a huge difference in their appetite to learn, right? And when we're talking about a gender transformative approach and a gender-specific approach, really thinking about the ways in which boys want to learn, right? How many times have we really asked them, what excites you? What sort of reading excites you? What projects would that look like instead of rote memorization? And so I'm going to, in the interest of time, just put a link in the chat. This is the program Lifting Barriers, which is active in these 3 countries. And we're currently implementing this whole school approach in Malawi with a partner, Kavwalk. Really interesting results are coming out of it. Boys are feeling supported and have that safe space in school. Teachers feel like they're more confident in class to address boys' needs as well as girls' needs, right? So this gender transformative approach not only engages boys, but does also lift the entire ship. And then in terms of other data points for masculinity-centered findings, there are also case studies at the country levels. Lesotho is on the UNESCO website currently, and then we also have the Malawi case study, which really, through qualitative and quantitative data, goes through different communities and really senses what are those barriers that Ruth had talked about earlier in Kenya that are preventing access and also interest and attainment and engagement in school. So be on the lookout for those, and just, big thank you to the panelists as well for sharing their insights.
Cody, you got so quickly to the root cause there, or one of the root causes around sort of restrictive masculinities. And it feels like applying that masculinities lens is actually often missing when we do this kind of analysis. So really appreciate you highlighting that for all of us here. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you so much to everyone who joined, especially to all of the panelists. I've sent a feedback form in the chat if you would be willing to fill that out for us, and then we will follow up with the recording and some of the key insights to continue the conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.